She kept her eyes down the morning she walked through the front doors of Ashcroft Hall as a servant. It was the only way she knew to keep from crying. The housekeeper, Mrs. Trent, was a stout woman with the kind of face that had forgotten how to be surprised by anything. She looked Cecilia over once, the plain gray dress, the small trunk, the careful hands folded in front, and decided she would do. She did not ask where Cecilia had come from. She did not ask why a woman with such clean diction and careful posture had applied for a housemaid position at a country estate in the middle of November. She simply handed her a cap and told her the linen cupboard was her responsibility every Tuesday and Friday. Cecilia thanked her and did not say that she had once slept in the room at the top of the east wing. The room with the yellow curtains that her mother had chosen. Ashcroft Hall had been her father's house, and then her uncle's house. And now, through a sequence of debts and legal maneuvers she still did not fully understand, it belonged to the Duke of Caldwell, a man she had never met, who had purchased the estate while she was still fighting a solicitor's letter in a rented room in Bath. She had come back because she had nowhere else to go, and because something in her could not let the house become entirely foreign to her without at least seeing it one more time. That was what she told herself. She was not entirely sure she believed it. The Duke arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Cecilia had settled into the rhythm of the household. She had heard things about him, the way one always hears things about a man before he appears. The cook, Mrs. Fallow, said he was not unkind, but was not warm either, that he had come back from the continent changed, the way men came back from places that had cost them something. The footman, young Thomas, said he hardly spoke at 10 dinner parties he'd attended in London. A woman from the village told Mrs. Trent he had broken an engagement 2 years prior, though no one seemed to know why. Cecilia filed these pieces away and told herself they did not concern her. She was standing in the upper corridor when she first saw him. He came in through the main entrance below, and she watched from the gallery railing. Just a moment, just enough to register the set of his shoulders, the way he handed his coat to the footman without looking at him, the brief pause he took in the hall before moving forward, as if he was deciding something, or remembering. His name was Dominic Ashford, the Duke of Caldwell. He was younger than she had imagined, and something about the way he stood in the entrance of her father's house, careful, almost cautious, made her feel, very unexpectedly, that she was not the only one who found this house heavy. She stepped back from the railing before he looked up. The first weeks of his residence followed a predictable pattern. He rose early and breakfasted alone. He rode out most mornings before the rest of the house was properly awake. He took his correspondence in the library, her father's library, with the oak desk her father had loved, and the portrait of her grandfather that she had grown up measuring her height against. She tried not to think about the portrait. She learned his schedule the way a housemaid must learn such things, not through direct instruction, but through observation, through the small evidence of a life. The cup moved to the right side of the saucer. The single candle burned down to nothing on the writing desk. The book left open face down on the chair by the window. He was reading Virgil. She noticed that and told herself it meant nothing. It was the middle of December when she encountered him directly for the first time. She had come to the library earlier than expected. Mrs. Trent had reorganized the morning schedule without informing her, and she did not realize he was there until she had already stepped inside. He was standing at the window with a letter in his hand, and he turned at the sound of her entry. For a moment neither of them spoke. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," she said. "I was told the room was to be aired this morning. I can come back." "It's fine." His voice was quieter than she had expected. He looked at her with a directness that was not rude, but was not indifferent either. "You're the new housemaid." "Yes, Your Grace." He nodded once and turned back to the window. She moved to open the far curtains, and the light came in gray and cold across the carpet. She worked quietly, the way she had learned to work, efficiently, without presence, invisible. It was a skill she had not known she possessed until she had needed it. "Did you know the previous family?" he asked. She stilled for just a moment. "I knew of them, Your Grace." "The estate passed through several hands quickly," he said. It was not quite a question. Yes, she said. It was not quite a question. I understand it did. He said nothing else. She finished with the curtains and left the room, and she stood in the corridor outside, with her hand flat against the wall, and made herself breathe slowly until her pulse returned to something reasonable. He had not recognized her. There was no reason he should. He had never met her, and she had changed enough. The plain dress, the cap, the careful absence of anything that might suggest she had once sat at the head of this table as a guest rather than cleaned around it as a servant. But something about being in that room with him, in her father's library, while he held a letter in hands that now held the deed to everything her father had built. It had taken more out of her than she expected. She pressed her palm harder against the wall and waited until it passed. He had a visitor in January. Her name was Sylvia Moresby. She arrived on a Wednesday in a carriage that cost more than the entire household's quarterly wages, and she was beautiful in the particular way of women who have always been told so. A little too aware of each room she entered, a little too practiced in the angle of her smile. Cecilia learned from Mrs. Fallow that Miss Moresby had been, at one point, the woman most expected to become the Duchess of Caldwell. The understanding between the families had been informal but widely accepted, and then the Duke had returned from his time on the continent, and something had shifted, and the understanding had quietly dissolved. Miss Moresby did not seem to accept that it had dissolved. She stayed 4 days. She was attentive to the Duke at every meal, and the Duke was polite in return with the careful courtesy of a man who had decided politeness was the safest distance he could maintain. She laughed at things that were not quite funny. She touched his arm twice that Cecilia witnessed, and each time he did not pull away but did not respond. On the third evening, Cecilia was sent to the drawing room with the tea service, and she arrived to find Miss Moresby mid-sentence in what was clearly a longer speech. "I only think that a house like this needs warmth," Miss Moresby was saying. "It's a beautiful property, Dominic, truly, but it feels rather unlived in, don't you think? A family would change that entirely." "The estate is well managed," the Duke said. "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant, Sylvia." The silence that followed was of the particular quality that means something has been said clearly without being said at all. Cecilia set down the tea service and left the room without looking at either of them. But she felt, with a small and inconvenient sharpness, that she had just seen something true about him, that underneath the quiet, the distance, the careful politeness, there was something in him that resisted being arranged, being decided, being handled. She recognized it, because she had felt it herself. Miss Moresby left on Friday. The house settled back into its rhythms, and Cecilia told herself firmly that she felt nothing about this. She almost managed to believe it. It was the snow that started it, in the end. There had been a heavy fall overnight, and the path that led from the kitchen garden to the rear gate was buried. Cecilia had gone out in the early morning to clear it. The delivery cart came Wednesdays, and the gate needed to be accessible, and she had been working for perhaps 20 minutes when she became aware of someone else in the garden. The Duke was standing near the old apple tree at the garden's edge, looking out over the white-covered grounds. He was not dressed for walking. Coat, but no hat, no gloves, and he had the look of someone who had come outside without quite deciding to. She kept working. It was not her place to speak unless spoken to, and she was nearly done, and it was cold, and she was not going to stand in a snow-covered garden composing sentences to say to the man who had bought her father's house. "You've been here since November," he said. She looked up. He was watching her. Not the way men sometimes watched servants, dismissively, peripherally, but with a directness that she had noticed before in the library. "Yes, Your Grace." "Most of the staff came with the estate," he said, "but Mrs. Trent mentioned you were new." "Yes, Your Grace." He was quiet for a moment. The snow around them muffled the world into a kind of intimacy she was entirely unprepared for. "What made you choose this particular estate?" he asked. It was not a normal question for a duke to ask a housemaid. She was aware of that, and she could see from his face that he was aware of it too, and had asked anyway. The position was available, she said carefully. I needed a position. And you had no other options. She met his eyes. I made a choice, she said. Your Grace. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. He looked down at the snow, and she looked back at her work, and for several minutes they remained in the garden together without speaking. Which was, she told herself, nothing. Absolutely nothing. You cleared the whole path, he said when she finally straightened and collected the shovel. It needed to be done, she said. The delivery cart, I know. He paused. Thank you. She nodded and turned toward the kitchen door, and she made it all the way back inside before she allowed herself to feel how strange it was to be thanked for something she had always previously been thanked for simply by virtue of living there. After that, things changed in the small ways that things change before the large ones. He began to notice her, not in any way she could have articulated to Mrs. Trent or the cook or anyone who might ask. There was nothing improper in it, nothing she could have pointed to, but she became aware of him in rooms the way you become aware of the fire when you have been cold for a long time. Not because it announces itself, but because the air is different. He asked her questions, small ones, at first. Whether she had a preference for the curtains in the morning room, whether the roses in the east garden had been blooming before the frost. Questions that a duke does not normally ask a housemaid. She answered them honestly and briefly and told herself it was simply his way of coming to know the property. Then one afternoon, she was in the portrait gallery, which was her least favorite room to clean and always had been. Too many faces she recognized, too many associations she had to carefully skirt around. And he came in while she was dusting the far end. He stood before the portrait of the previous Lord Harwick for a long time. Do you know anything about the family who lived here? He asked without turning. She was quiet for a moment. A little, she said. The solicitor mentioned a daughter, he said. She contested the sale briefly but withdrew. Cecilia kept her cloth moving along the frame of a painting she did not need to look at to see. I had heard something of that, she said. He turned then. It must have been difficult, he said, losing a house that had been in a family for generations. She looked at him directly. I imagine it was, she said. He was watching her with that same careful attention, and she had the sudden, vertiginous feeling that he was closer to the truth than she wanted him to be, that something in her voice, or her face, or the particular quality of her stillness was giving her away. I intend to maintain the estate well, he said. I want you to know that. The people on it, the house itself, I don't take the responsibility lightly. I know, she said. And meant it. I can see that, Your Grace. He held her gaze a beat longer than was necessary, and she went back to her dusting, and neither of them spoke again. But something had passed between them in that gallery that she could not name and could not dismiss. She told him in March, not because she had planned to, not because she had reached some rational conclusion about risk and honesty and the wisdom of transparency. She told him because it was a Tuesday evening, and she had gone to the library after everyone else was in bed to return a book she had borrowed from the shelf without asking, an old copy of Persuasion she had loved since she was 16, her mother's copy, the one her mother had written her name in on the flyleaf, and he was there. He looked at the book in her hands. He looked at the handwriting on the flyleaf, which she had forgotten to consider, and he read the name there. He looked at her. Cecilia Harwick, he said. It was not a question. She held the book against her chest, which was possibly the only honest thing she did in the full 30 seconds that followed. Yes, she said finally. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him process it. She could see the moment the full shape of it assembled itself. All the pieces, the questions, the pauses, the too careful answers, the way she had moved through this house like someone navigating from memory. She expected anger. She expected something cold and formal, a dismissal, a lecture about the position she had put him in. How long were you planning to stay, he said. She blinked. I hadn't decided. What were you hoping to find? I don't know. It came out more honestly than she intended. I just needed to be here for a while, before it was entirely someone else's. He sat down in the chair by the desk, her father's chair. He leaned back in it and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then he said, I bought this estate at an auction. I was told there were no family members making claims. I withdrew my claim, she said. The solicitor's costs I didn't have. She stopped. I couldn't sustain the case. I see. He was quiet again. Then, very quietly, why didn't you say something? When I asked about the family, when I mentioned the daughter. Because I didn't know what would happen if I did. She met his eyes. And because I could see you loved this house too. Already. In the way you moved through it. In the way you asked about it. She paused. I didn't want to make it into a battlefield. He looked at her for a long moment. Do you want me to leave? She said. No, he said, just that. No, he said. Just that. No. She stood in her father's library in her housemaid's dress, with her mother's book held against her chest. And she looked at the man who now owned everything she had grown up with. And she felt something she was not prepared for and could not immediately name. He was still looking at her. I would like to know you, he said. Properly. Not as a housemaid, as... He stopped, chose his words. As yourself. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, I should warn you that I'm considerably more opinionated than a housemaid is supposed to be. Something moved across his face, and this time it was, unmistakably, a smile. I had begun to suspect that, he said. What followed was not simple. Nothing about it was. She could not simply become a guest in a house where she had spent 3 months as a servant, and the staff found it confusing. And Mrs. Trent looked at her for a full week with an expression that suggested profound personal injury. The solicitors had to be involved eventually. There were conversations about what proper looked like and who had a right to what claim, and what, precisely, the Duke of Caldwell's intentions were. His intentions, it turned out, were direct and unambiguous, which she had somehow expected by then. He asked her properly, in the garden, in April, when the first of the roses were beginning to come back. He stood in the place where the old apple tree had dropped its last leaves, and he asked her if she would do him the honor. And he looked at her with that same clear directness she had first noticed in the library in December, the gaze that did not flinch and did not perform, that simply looked and waited. She said yes. She said yes because she had watched him choose the library over the drawing room, and Virgil over small talk and silence over performance and hard questions over comfortable ones. She said yes because he had sat in her father's chair and asked her what she had been hoping to find, and it had been the right question. She said yes because 3 years ago she had lost this house and thought she had lost everything tethered to it. And here, on the other side of that loss, was something she had not anticipated. Something that was not restoration so much as it was transformation. Something new. They were married in June, at the church in the village that her father had attended every Sunday of his adult life. The rose garden at Ashcroft Hall was fully in bloom by the reception, and Mrs. Fallow, who had been somewhat scandalized and then somewhat delighted, and then entirely reconciled to the whole affair, made a wedding cake that was perhaps the finest thing Cecilia had ever tasted. Mrs. Trent gave her a brief and fierce hug in the corridor before the ceremony, and did not mention the linen cupboard. Dominic held her hand through the whole morning, and she let him. And it felt like the most natural thing in the world, that evening, standing at the window of what had once been her parents' room and was now their room, she looked out over the gardens in the last of the summer light. The same gardens she had looked out over as a child. The same light, the same roses. And she felt the house settle around her differently than it had in November, differently than it had in all the months of careful invisibility. It felt like coming home. Not because it had been returned to her. It hadn't been. It had been lost, and something else had happened in the loss, something she could not have seen from the far side of it. Dominic came to stand behind her, and she leaned back slightly and felt his steadiness there. And neither of them spoke, because there wasn't anything that needed saying. The roses were still in bloom. The house was full of light.